Go the Distance, Chapter 16, Leverage. Meg stared at the bow and arrow and clapper worriedly. If Athena was suddenly granting gifts for her journey, there has to be a reason. Meg looked ahead at the newly calm waters and the endless miles of trees and wondered, what out there would cause me to be reckless? I've seen that thing before, Phil said as she placed the instrument carefully inside her satchel. I think it has a name. Rota? Rata? No, that's not it. Tala. It's called a clapper, Meg said. Phil scratched his left ear. No, it's got an official name. I tell you, it's on the tip of my tongue. It's a kratala. What's a kratala? Phil's smile faded. I forget. It's important, though, I think. Well, it looks like you have time to remember. Meg stared at the waterway. We're barely moving. The water was almost stagnant now, the breeze non-existent. Up ahead, the river grew narrower, and the waters became almost turquoise blue. It was so shallow that she could see white sands at the bottom. Rocks rose to greet them on one side, while thick vegetation and trees were on the other. There was no sign of life on the riverbeds, nor another boat to be found. Eerily, she didn't even hear wildlife. For such a serene spot, it was completely deserted. Meg looked at the mast and saw it was split in half. So much for this sail. Wouldn't work if it was whole anyway, Phil said, putting his hand on the split mast. No wind, no current. Even the water doesn't want to go where we're headed. But at least we're moving in the right direction. If your instincts were correct, we'd finally made it to the river Archeon. When we cross it with Koktos and the Priflithagon rivers, we should find your entrance. And Sharon will be waiting, Meg said, almost to herself. She'd hidden with the ferrymen to the underworlds numerous times. Hades had always traveled to and from the underworld with the chauffeur, but she'd never ridden with Sharon by herself before. She shuddered at the thought. Phil did the same, though his chill seemed to be from sticking a hoof in the water. You feel this river? It's dead already, as cold as ice. Meg dipped her fingertips off to the side of the boat, and they grew numb after a few seconds. No wonder she saw no wildlife or other people here. Acherion might have looked beautiful, but it truly was the gateway to hell. She stretched her legs out on the bench and leaned back, her face to the sun. So now what do we do? I don't have time to just sit here and wait for a breeze. Relax, Red. I'm sure a breeze will pick up at some point. In the meantime, we row. Phil picked up an oar, and Meg did the same. For some reason, as clear and pristine as the water looked, moving the oar through the river felt like pushing through sludge. It's not working, Meg said in frustration, and put down her oar. She pulled out her hourglass. It was almost halfway empty. I've got less than 6 days, and the underworld is a labyrinth. How am I going to find Katerina and get her out of there before the sand runs out? You've got to be smart, Phil said as he continued to row. We both know Hades ain't gonna be happy to see you again, so avoid him as long as you can. You said the place is a labyrinth, but you should know your way around there more than the average soul, no? Kind of, Meg admitted. Good. Stick to the shadows and avoid Hades' minions. You've got to find Katerina before he finds you. Did Aegeus give you any clues that will help you find her down there? Aegeus made her sound like a saint, so she's probably not in Tartarus, but Elysium sounds like a long shot, too. I guess she's in Asphodel Meadows, like most? Phil scratched his chin. That's still a large place. How are you going to narrow things down? Meg thought for a moment. Aegeus said she has a younger sister, Layla, who died when Katerina was young. I'm sure she's with her. Good. Phil's face lit up. I mean, not that the kid's dead, but it's a clue to find Katerina. What else? I know Layla loved poppy fields. So did Katerina, and telling tall tales. Meg yawned. Suddenly she was quite tired. Were the events of the last couple of days finally catching up to her? That's about all I know. We had a lot of ground to cover in a short amount of time. Yeah, tragic love affair, I know. Stay focused on find that kid, Phil said, his eyes looking as heavy as hers felt. We may have a plan to get you in the joint, but how are you going to get out? I'm not sure, Meg realized as she settled down on the bench again. The boat was barely moving. But Hercules did give me this. She pulled the orchid out of her satchel. It allows me to call from 3 times. Well, 2 since I already used it once. Her cheeks burned. Then that's your ticket out of hell. Literally, Phil said. Don't waste those petals. Use them to have Herc get you out of there once you find her. Maybe. Meg stared at the flower. She wasn't the rescue-y type. Maybe she could get out on her own. Phil shook his head. You really are stubborn, Red. You know that? He yawned again. It made her yawn once more, too. She tucked the orchid back in her satchel and stretched. Would it be so wrong to take a nap? Meg started to lie down on the bench opposite Phil, who was already drifting off. She sat up with a start. Phil, I think this river is putting us to sleep. Sleep? He murmured. Why would a river do that? He curled up in a ball and started to snore. Phil? Peg? She looked around to see that the horse was curled up on the deck, already fast asleep. Meg's heart quickened. Stay awake, she told herself, but her eyes were closing almost of their own volition. This river had somehow taken hold, as if it didn't want them to see exactly where they were going or how to get back there again. And no matter how hard she fought it, within minutes she had drifted right with it. When Meg awoke sometime later, she noticed the sun straight away. It had moved. No longer was it high overhead, it was now halfway across the sky, and shadows were stretched from the trees. It had to be late afternoon already, and it looked like they had barely moved. She looked over at Phil and found him still snoring away, along with Pegasus. She hurried over to wake them. Phil, Pegasus, she said, and the satyr stirred. The river put us to sleep. Pegasus flapped his wings and blinked rapidly, as if rising from a long slumber. Phil rubbed his eyes. What? No, how? He yawned, stretched his hooves, and looked around. How long were we out? A while, Meg said with a groan, and we haven't moved at all. No! Phil rushed to the side of the boat and looked around. These trees definitely look different, I think. He stood on the boat bench. And look, up ahead, there's a meadow. We haven't seen a meadow yet. A meadow? Meg joined him to the front of the boat to look. Something gold glinted in the distance and made her blink. What was that? The boat drifted closer, and suddenly a clearing appeared. Phil was right. The boat had moved toward a meadow dotted with trees full of low-hanging fruit. Were those golden apples? You haven't lived till you've had one of these, Nutmeg, she heard a voice in her head say. They're to die for. As a matter of fact, many of man has. Huh! Hades, she remembered, seeing him eating one once or twice, savoring every last bite down to the core. It might have been one of the few occasions she'd seen the god happy. Usually, the only thing that did that was talking about his Titan takeover, or a large group of souls showing up to his realm at once. Those golden apples were an elusive bright spot in his life. If she could get her hand on just one of those pieces of fruit, maybe she'd have some leverage with Hades if they crossed paths. Her eyes moved to the shoreline. There was a short gate was all that stood between the apples and the river. There was even a group of baskets sitting on the ground near the gate, just begging to be used to collect fruit. Phil, Meg said excitedly, we've got to steer this boat over to the shore. Those apples are Hades' favorite. If I bring some with me, I might be able to barter with the Hellion. Phil moved to the right side of the ship and frowned. Yeah, no can do. That orchard looks like it could be on the Hesperides land. The Hesperides? Her mother had told her legends about the Hesperides, who guarded fruit said to give people immortality. No wonder Hades enjoyed eating them. He was already immortal, so taking that gift away from a human would be something he could relish. But this couldn't be the nymph's orchard. The legend said nothing about being near the entrance to the underworld, did it? Why did she think there was a piece of the story she was forgetting? I don't like this, Red, Phil said. Those apples are not meant for human consumption. Good, I don't plan on eating one, said Meg, rowing closer to the side. They're for Hades if I run into him. See that gate? It means stay out. We can't trespass. No one is even going to know we're here, Meg argued. The orchard is deserted. Unless there's some sleeping dragon around here somewhere just waiting to eat us. I wouldn't put it past those nymphs to have an extra layer of protection around apples so rare. Phil tried to rush in front of her. Don't do anything rash. Let's call in Athena, or Hercules if you want. I'm sure they'll tell you this isn't a good idea. Meg snorted. Phil was being ridiculous. She gently went around him. I'm not wasting their time on something like this. We don't need their help, Phil. I'm telling you, dragons are massive. If one was here, we could see it. She pulled her oar through the water, turning the boat toward shore. I'll be quick, I promise you. Meg jumped out of the boat as soon as she was close enough. That way Phil couldn't stop her. I'll be back quicker than your hooves can get you off this boat. Red, Phil growled. You're being reckless. Remember what Athena said. Don't be a fool. Meg ignored him, stepping onto land and walking swiftly to the gate. It was unlocked. Huh, she wanted to say. This was meant to be. She pushed the gate open and walked a few yards to the first tree she found, her eyes darting back and forth for any sign of movement. There were none. Phil is such a worrier, she thought. The trees were so full, the golden apples were hanging as low as Meg's head. They were practically begging to be picked. She reached up for the first shiny apple she saw and gave it a quick twist from the branch, hearing the small snap as it broke free. She turned to Phil and pegged triumphantly. See? No problem. She'd barely gotten the words out of her mouth when she heard an ear-splitting screech. Meg turned and saw countless birds swooping over the orchard, angrily heading straight toward her.